Hello, my name is Sarah Oakley. I'm a health visitor, nurse and international board certified lactation consultant, and I specialise in tongue tie. I'm going to talk to you today about what the difference is between a tongue tie and a normal lingual frenulum. Lots of people refer to a tongue tie as a restricted lingual frenulum. And that kind of tells us what the difference is really. Obviously, a normal lingual frenulum is nice and stretchy and long and flexible and allows full functioning of the tongue. A restricted lingual frenulum, or tongue tie in layman's terms, is short, tight and attached to the tongue in such a way that it causes restriction in the tongue function. So the key movements that we look for when we're looking at whether a tongue is moving normally or not are lateralization, extension and elevation. And probably the most key movement of those three is actually the elevation of the tongue, or the lift of the tongue. So when we're assessing babies for a tongue tie, for a restriction in the lingual frenulum or restricted tongue function, we're looking to see how much lift they have in their tongues. And we tend to assess this while they're crying because that's the best time to do it. So when your baby cries, what they should do is open their mouths really, really wide, and then the tongue should lift at least halfway or higher towards the roof of the mouth. If it's not lifting at least halfway, then that's likely to compromise the feeding experience that you're having. And elevation is crucial in terms of efficiency, because when a baby latches on to the breast, what they need to be able to do is they need to be able to press that breast tissue up against the roof of the mouth by lifting the tip of the tongue. And obviously if the tongue is being held down by a restricted lingual frenulum, by a tongue tie, that's not going to happen. Now, if they can't compress that breast tissue up against the roof of the mouth, they don't create a good seal. And if they don't create a good seal, it's then difficult to create the vacuum needed to draw the milk from the breast. And milk is largely transferred from the breast or the bottle by vacuum. So the baby needs to be able to lift the tip of the tongue and compress the breast tissue against the roof of the mouth, and then drop the back of the tongue to create a space and negative pressure to draw the milk out of the breast, to literally suck the milk out of the breast. Now, initially when baby latches on and they stimulate that letdown, once the milk starts to let down, you get that nice gushy flow of milk. That in itself will help with the milk transfer, but the baby needs to be able to create some vacuum initially to stimulate that letdown. And once that letdown reflex starts to subside, which is usually after a few minutes, the baby then needs to continue to create vacuum to draw the milk and keep the flow going. Otherwise, if they're struggling with that, they'll often come off the breast and give up, and then a few minutes later want to go back on again because they're still hungry. So classically, a lot of tongue-tied babies will feed very nicely through the letdown and then quickly tire and give up after the letdown. So the elevation is crucial and is probably the most significant movement that we're looking at. If a baby's got really good elevation of the tongue, it's not likely that it's a restricted lingual frenulum that's causing the feeding problems. So good elevation is a really good sign that your baby probably hasn't got a tongue tie. But you need to be careful when you're looking at it, because some babies cheat. So some babies will appear to lift the tongue up into the roof of the mouth, but they're doing that by bringing the lower jaw up. So if your baby has got a very narrow, what we call letterbox mouth when they cry, and it seems like the tongue is in the roof of the mouth, they're actually cheating. And if you pull the chin down, you'll find the tongue will come down with it. So it needs to be assessed with the baby crying with a very wide open mouth. Otherwise, you can misinterpret what you're seeing quite easily. In terms of tongue extension, babies should be able to poke their tongues out over their bottom lip, like that, like I can do. And so you should be able to see the tongue coming out well over the bottom lip. And normally the tongue will look quite rounded. If there's a restriction there, it will often have a little cleft in the tip of the tongue, or look a little bit heart-shaped, or maybe very heart-shaped if it's a very tight restriction. So if the tongue can poke out over the bottom lip and looks nice and rounded, that's very often a good sign that there isn't a restriction there. But we need to be quite careful with that, because I do see babies with tongue ties where they can actually poke their tongue out over their bottom lip, but they can't sustain that tongue extension. And they need to be able to sustain the tongue extension in order to be able to secure the breast tissue in the mouth and to sustain that latch. So some babies will be able to poke the tongue out, draw the breast tissue in and latch onto the breast, but then the tension underneath the tongue will pull that tongue backwards. So once they're on the breast, they will slip down into a shallow latch, or they may slip off the breast, or they may make a clicking sound where the tongue is slipping back and the seal is being broken. So just because a baby can extend its tongue over the bottom lip does not exclude the possibility of tongue tie. But obviously, you know, it is something that we're looking for when we're doing the assessment. So a restriction in tongue extension will cause problems, but that restriction in tongue extension can sometimes be more subtle. So if your baby can't poke their tongue out over the bottom lip, they may well have a tongue tie, but just because they can poke their tongues out doesn't mean they haven't. And I have a lot of mums coming to me saying, the GP said it can't be a tongue tie because I can see the baby poking their tongue out over their lip, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And you can get a tongue extension restriction in cases where the neck is actually tight and restricted. So in some cases, when the babies are born, they can develop neck tension and strain as they come through the birth canal, particularly if it's been a traumatic birth, if they've had to have assistance in terms of forceps or ventouses, or if the labour has ended in an emergency C-section. You can sometimes get quite a lot of neck strain and tension, and that can actually affect the extension of the tongue. So if you know, sometimes you'll see a baby with a restricted tongue extension, but it isn't actually necessarily due to a tongue tie or restricted lingual frenulum. Lateralization is the side-to-side movement of the tongue and is not so crucial in terms of breast and bottle feeding, but actually is more crucial in terms of solid feeding. So we look at that as well when we're assessing for tongue tie. And a baby that's got a tongue tie often cannot move its tongue freely from side to side, so they can't swish their tongue, like I'm doing there, from side to side freely. So that's another movement that we look at. Again, sometimes you can have some asymmetry in that lateralization. So sometimes the baby can fully lateralize to one side but not the other side. And again, that might relate to neck strain and tension from birthing rather than actually from a tight lingual frenulum. So we need to be careful when we're diagnosing a tongue tie that we're taking into account the entire history of this baby, you know, the birth history, the medical history, the feeding history, a feeding assessment, so that we don't misdiagnose, because there is obviously the potential to do that, because a lingual frenulum, having a stringy fold of membrane underneath your tongue, is actually completely normal anatomy. So there is potential for babies to be diagnosed as having a tongue tie when actually the frenulum is quite normal. But those are the three movements that we look at. There are other movements that we can assess, and we can assess the peristalsis of the tongue, the cupping, the sucking, and all of that. And I include all of that in my own assessments. But the key three movements we're looking at are extension, elevation, and lateralization. And that's how we help to determine whether it is actually a tongue tie or whether it is just a normal lingual frenulum. So I hope that helps to clarify that.